Hello, gentlemen. Yes, I am. I wasn't here for it, but I believe Brother Clark called us yesterday posthole diggers, and so I'm one of those. I do that too, by the way. Yes, I have my bachelor's degree is in genetics, and my PhD is in entomology, both from Texas A&M University. And I worked at the university in a research capacity for 22 years. I wasn't a faculty member. I did substitute classes. I taught periodically, but that was not part of my role. So I was not a professor. I was not in the faculty. I did research. I was in the technical staff in the entomology department for 13 years, which is in the College of Agriculture. And then I was in the College of Medicine, once again doing research for 9 years. And of course, like all of us, we all end up working for Jason. And so now I'm at Rollo Insurance. Man, I wish he was here. This would have been so much funnier. I actually brought my name tag from Rollo, so I'll put it on for Jason. I'm the Director of Quality Assurance now, so add that to my list of things. So I'm going to echo a lot of what Dink said yesterday, and I'm glad I actually didn't finalize my talk until after he finished his. I wanted to know what kind of introduction he was going to give so that I wouldn't, plow the same ground, not because it's not worthy, but because of the issue of time. And so he did a lot of the introduction yesterday, and so I'm thankful for that. Today we are going to talk about evidences again. I'm going to echo what he said regarding, maybe emphasize things just a little differently. The point here is the elephant in the room is evolution. We're not talking about evolution specifically today, but that is what we're defending against with conversations like this. But rather than, in Dink's talk, he emphasized knowing these things to give an answer to someone who is especially maybe militant to you. I want us to dwell on these things from the aspect of knowing this information, even if you don't know it in detail. But these are things that should build our faith. What we're looking at when we investigate, when we look at the science behind something, we're using man's wisdom to look at God's workmanship. And so all of these things should build in us faith. When we look at the way that the world works, that should not challenge our faith, it should build our faith. And so that's one of the points I want us to leave with today. And so for 5 or 10 minutes, I am going to give a little bit of an introduction and some principles that I want us to put in our mind. Then for about 20 minutes, 25 minutes, I want to talk about general immunity. Some of these things I expect to be familiar to you, and some of them perhaps not. And then at the very end, I want to take a little tiny aspect of it, and I want to show you something that I'm pretty sure you don't know anything about, that's going to highlight a point that's going to really take the design argument and hammer it home. It's really going to take it to the next level. And I've got 10 slides this morning. Let's see, these are my notes, so I need to do this here. And so I want us to put in our minds some principles as we anchor ourselves, especially when we're talking about an extra biblical topic. And so, so in this series, what we're doing, the evidences series, we're giving evidence for the teleological argument, right? Design implies a designer. Dink went over that yesterday. It also implies that there's a purpose in that design. When you study evolution and what evolution teaches, evolution claims that there is design, but without a designer and without purpose. Dink referenced Hebrews 3, verse 4, of course. Every house is built by some man. So we see that, once again, not in the context, but just the principle there. When you see a house, you know it's built by somebody. When Jesus says to count the cost, if you're building a tower, you know it's going to be built by somebody. It wasn't just the bricks assembled themselves. But the verse before that, in Hebrews 3:3, is just as important to this discussion. He who buildeth a house has more honor than the house. And so when we're studying these things, what we're doing when we're looking at them is we're ultimately giving honor back to God for what He's done. And so please keep that in mind. So in addition to that apologetic reason, the proper study of nature and science is bringing honor to God, the builder. Romans 1:20, for the invisible things of Him, for the creation of the world, are clearly seen, being understood by things that are made. If they had no excuse when Paul wrote that in the book of Romans 2,000 years ago, and the things that we know, some of the stuff that I'm going to show has just been discovered in the last 20 years, certainly within the last 100 years. And at every level of science just shows us more and more complexity. Then if they had no excuse then how much less of an excuse do we have today? We have less of an excuse now than the doubter would have had 2,000 years ago. And so even though we're not talking about evolution directly today, I do want to point out that the BCS congregation in April started a summer series on apologetics. I did the first 4 lessons on the introduction. John did the next 4 or so on where we got the Bible from. The next set of 4 during the month of June, starting next Wednesday, is going to be on evolution. And so if you're interested in maybe what would, in a typical lectureship, be the introduction to these kinds of lessons, you can find those ultimately are going to be on the BCS website starting next Wednesday when we have our first one. So there'll be a greater discussion of evolution on that. And so back to things that are extra biblical. What I mean is things that are perhaps true, but God has not chosen to reveal them to us, right? Deuteronomy 29, he reserves the secret things for himself. Or perhaps things haven't been told to us because they don't pertain to life and godliness. They're not part of our spiritual necessity. 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 3. For example, we know Jesus did many things that are not written down. We're curious as to what they are. We would like to know them perhaps, but they're not necessary for us. And so in these principles to put in our mind before we get into the discussion, number one, I want us to keep in mind that the Bible is not a science textbook. Just like it's not a math book, just like it's not a cookbook. That doesn't mean that it's lacking. It's just not what the purpose is. Scripture is given to us for our spiritual perfection, for living a life of good works, 2 Timothy 3:17. We don't expect it to tell us everything we want to know, specifically in this case about the natural world. So we'd like to have a cure for cancer. We don't go find the cure for cancer in the Bible. That doesn't mean that there isn't one. It just means it's not a biblical, spiritual subject. We don't go there to find out how to build a bridge. We don't go there to find out how to use our smartphone. All of that information is valuable as we live in the natural world, but it's not part necessarily of life and godliness, so the Scripture doesn't reveal it to us. So what is science? Number 2, science is how we, in the modern world, science is how we describe the natural world, and we do it using our mind and our senses. Please keep in mind that science does not explain God. It cannot. It is not possible. When we look at nature, whether we're the ancient Greeks and we're looking up at the stars in the sky and we notice that a few of them move and we call them planets, and that then opens up the world of physics to us and we begin just making those kinds of discoveries, or whether, like me in entomology for a very long time, you were studying the kidney of a mosquito. I can tell you about that later. Okay, 13 years. What all of those things reveal to us, no matter where you are in time, if you're looking at the natural world, science is telling us what? What is the natural world telling us? That God exists, right? That He is. We have to go to Him to find out what He wants us to know about Him. All we can get from the natural world is that He is. We know that because of we know the invisible things exist because we clearly see the visible things. Romans 1. Once again, that was covered in better detail yesterday. God cannot be explained. He cannot be perceived with our senses. And so don't expect to do that, and don't fall for any of the arguments that might try to lead you down that road. But we can see His workmanship. Number 3, science is the description of God's workmanship, not a description of Him. Now, that doesn't mean we might not be able to understand some principles or some characteristics of God, but it's not about Him. Just like when you're studying the pot, that doesn't tell you much about the potter. Science as a category, this was a big one, number 4, is man's wisdom, with all the limits that entails, right? It is a product of man's investigation, man's imagination, and man's understanding. Any discovery that is made or explanation that is formulated regarding the natural world is using man's wisdom. Isaiah 55, verses 8 and 9, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither your ways my ways, saith the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways." So God is above any conclusion we can come to in science. 1 Corinthians 1:25, "The foolishness of God is wiser than men." Man can be wrong, and science often is. Scientists admit this. It is a scientific principle Contrary to some of the current politics, it is a scientific principle that there is no certainty in science. Nothing is ever rock solid. We know, though, as Christians, once again, Brother Tom mentioned 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 6 this morning. As Christians, we are not walking by sight, which is how a scientist walks, but by faith. And we need to keep that, please keep that in mind. That teleological argument, number 5, something does not come from nothing. What we're talking about here is origins. The things that we see in the natural world were made by things that we cannot see. Hebrews chapter 11. The clay pot demands the potter, Isaiah 64, verse 8, Jeremiah 18:6. A tower demands an architect, Luke 14:28. When God says in Genesis 1:3, let there be light, he was not copying something that someone else had built. He was doing something for the first time. Light didn't exist. It came into being. It didn't exist before. In fact, you could argue there was no before. And when it came into existence, it was mature, it was complete, it was functional, it was exactly what God wanted to be, and in verse 4, he declares it good, as an example. But those are things we're going to get into a little more in the evolution series here at the BCS congregation in a few weeks. So please keep those principles in mind as we go. So immunity. So God created the natural world to be self-perpetuating, whether that's reproduction, right? Growth and maturity, defense and healing. One aspect of self-perpetuation is the need to protect yourself, to heal from wounds and disease, right? Now, in the modern world, we understand that could be bacterial, it could be viral, it could be parasites, it could be toxins, it could be your own body attacking itself with things like cancer. And we do have biblical examples of people being overcome with disease. Leviticus chapter 13 is the rules concerning the diagnosis for leprosy. Turn to 2 Kings chapter 20. John said, I hope there's some Bible. That's one of the dangers with an extra biblical topic. But in 2 Kings chapter 20, we have the account of King Hezekiah near the end of his life, or at least what he thinks is the end of his life. In verse 1, in those days was Hezekiah sick unto death, and the prophet Isaiah the son of Amoz came to him, and saith unto him, Thus saith the Lord, set thine house in order, for thou shalt die and not live. Isaiah gets right to the point. No beating around the bush. Then he turned his face to the wall, Hezekiah, and prayed unto the Lord, saying, I beseech thee, O Lord, remember now how I have walked before thee in truth and with a perfect heart, and have done which is good in thy sight. And Hezekiah wept sore. And it came to pass, afore Isaiah was gone out in the middle of the court, so Isaiah hadn't even gotten very far, that the word of the Lord comes to him and tells him to turn again. Verse 5, tell Hezekiah, the captain of my people, thus saith the Lord God of David, thy father, I have heard thy prayer. Right? And so Isaiah goes back to him. He's going to get 15 years added here to the end of his life. But how? Medically, how? Verse 7, and Isaiah said, take a lump of figs, and they took and laid it on the boil, and he recovered. And so you might think this is a miracle. I don't think this is a miracle, because what Isaiah tells him is in 3 days you're going to go present yourself in the temple. Why did it take 3 days? In Luke chapter 17, when Jesus comes across the 10 lepers, he tells them, go show yourself to the priest. He never said you're healed. He said, go show yourself to the priest. Well, he knew he was going to heal them. They said, have mercy on us. They go. They're healed on the way. One of them returns. Why did they have to go show themselves to the priest? Because in Leviticus chapter 14, the first 2 or 3 verses there, if you were healed of your leprosy, you still had to be declared clean by the high priest. And then you were allowed back into the community. You brought some sacrifices, and you were allowed back into society. So there's a hypothesis there that's quarantine, disease control. That might be one of the reasons. I don't think that's the ultimate reason God sets the rules that he does. But Hezekiah, we don't see any of that. Okay? There's nothing instantaneous. In 3 days, he's going to have to go present himself in the temple to show to the priest that his leprosy is healed. Why? It's going to take 3 days. How was it healed? Whatever was in this poultice of figs that was put on Hezekiah healed his skin wound Perhaps it was starting out small, and in 3 days later it was going to spread, and we understand things about sepsis today, and what looked like a little tiny wound turned into something that in 3 days would kill you. Have John tell you his story from the last few days. Right? How many people can be fine, they go swimming, and 3 days later the thing's eating their brain and they're dead. Right? So exactly what happened to Hezekiah, once again, the Bible's not a science textbook, we don't know, but we can see a little example here of something that was going on. And so what happened here? How was Hezekiah healed? Naturally. Right? And so I want us to think about this. Immunity, and this is a line from not me. This is a science definition. Immunity is a system of biological processes that protect an organism from disease. Okay? Think about some of these words and the principles that we discussed. It's a system. What does that mean? If you're a system, it means you're planned. You have to be. Because you have multiple parts that have to work together, that are coordinated, whether they cascade or whether they, two things have to get together for a third thing to happen. It's a biological process. We're talking about natural things here. In Genesis chapter 4, when Eve says, "The Lord's given me a man," right? How was Abel born? Naturally. That was new. He was the first one that had been born that way. You think it was a surprise to Eve? I bet it was a little bit of a surprise, right? Abel was born naturally. Adam and Eve were not. Well, healing is a biological process. If it takes you 3 days to get over your boil, or 2 years to recover from cancer with the medicine they give you, or whatever, that's not a miracle. Now, in the vernacular, we might use that language, but that's how God has designed the system to work. That you have things in you that you're not even aware of that are working to your benefit. And then protect, we see purpose. So, immunity. Immunity is a layered system. It's a layered biological process. So you have some things that are not immunity themselves, but are part of the process. Like Dink talked yesterday about the eyeball. You have eyelashes and eyelids. Your eyebrows have a function, but it's not really sight, but they're helping out your eye. And so when it comes to immunity, there are certain things like, and maybe not just in humans, but in other animals. But in animals, you have things like shells and skin that block parasites and pathogens from getting across. You think about it, a chicken, they tell you to wash your eggs because you're going to die from salmonella. The chicken sits on them for 21 days out in the heat, and they turn into a chicken and not a rotten mess of salmonella. That's a design, right? It's protected. You have mucus in your nose, in your sinus cavity, and other places that physically traps particles. And then you have reactions like sneezing and coughing to get that out of you and remove it. You have stomach acid, which the pH through your digestive system acts to counteract some of these things that go on. Dink mentioned yesterday eyes, and so you have your tears. There's a flushing mechanism that moves the physical contaminants out of the way, and then you also have chemicals, lysozymes, and other things in your tears themselves that are antibacterial. In humans, the immune system itself can be thought of as there's two components to it. There's the innate immune system and the adaptive immune system. The innate system is something that we all have that's pretty much similar in all of us, and we all react very, very similarly. So it's nonspecific. So if we get an infection, we're all going to get a fever. Something we all get, is a fever. That's a reaction that the body is going to have. We're going to have pain, we're going to have swelling, we're going to have inflammation. Those are part of the innate immune system. It's quick. Once you cut yourself, things immediately go into action, even if you don't see any effect yet. It has no memory. So when you cut yourself and your wound gets infected and then you heal from it and you cut yourself again, you still could get infected again by whatever infected you the last time. Some people have a staph infection and then they get a staph infection and they get a staph infection. They're just very susceptible to these things. So the innate immune system has no memory. It's pre-programmed in your DNA. And that's going to be important for what I want to talk about at the very, very end. All of this is in your DNA, but there's aspects of the adaptive immunity that is a little different than being pre-programmed. And so antibiotics, for an example, are something that fits in innate immunity, and so other organisms have similar processes, and so that's how penicillin was discovered. There's a fungus, and it killed the bacteria that were trying to come in and invade it. Well, the scientist looked at that and said, how is that happening? He went in, investigated, and found a chemical that the fungus was excreting into the environment it lived in that was antibacterial, and that's how penicillin was discovered. And now we have an entire, a broad array. Antibiotics, revolutionized the 20th century, if you've never thought about it. Adaptive immunity is specific. So if you have gotten measles, you're never going to get them again. And if you've never gotten measles, just because the guy across the room got measles and recovered doesn't mean that you're immune from it. So you can get measles, but when you recover from it, your body remembers that. And so that's a specific kind of immunity. It is slower because your body has to figure out, what do I have, and learn what it is and react and produce some of the things we're going to talk about. And this is called an acquired immunity. And so we all, when it comes to innate immunity, are going to react very similarly. But when it comes to adaptive immunity, some people are going to get things and some people aren't. Some people never got COVID. Some people don't get HIV. Some people don't get the flu. Just because you get chicken pox, you might not get this other thing. There's a huge amount of variability. Once again, that's the thing I want to talk about here at the end. So let's talk about innate immunity here for just a second. Once again, some of these things should be familiar to you. So if you physically injure yourself, what happens? Say you're cutting up some chicken to cook supper and you cut your finger, right? It's not severe, but it's pretty deep. You put a Band-Aid on it so you can finish doing what you're doing. You eat and you go to bed and you forget about it till the next morning, and so you wake up and what do you have? Well, the bleeding has stopped, but the cut is red, it's swollen, it's warm, it maybe hurts to bend your finger. What you've done, or what has happened, is your innate immunity has been activated. So you've got something that wounds your tissue, and the physical breaking of your cells releases certain chemicals into your tissue, into the bloodstream, that tell everything else what has happened. So all of us have automobiles. We have oil. You have oil in your engine, right? How do you know you have oil in your engine? Do you see it? When do you see it? When it's right, or when you check it? When there's a problem, or when there's not a problem? So if you go out into the parking lot and you see oil on the concrete, right, that indicates you have a problem. It's the same thing here, right? The cells are fine, they've been damaged, and their contents have now been released out into the environment, and that's a signal to the other cells that say, oh, somebody's broken, right? Keep in mind the principles we talked about here. Think about the plan behind this. And so those chemicals, whether it's eicosanoids, prostaglandins, those of you who are taking omega-3, omega-6, omega-9 oils, fish oils, all those kinds of things, what you're doing that for is your prostaglandins in your body are out of balance, and so you're going to take those fatty acid pills, the little vitamin you take every morning. What you're really doing is you are trying to rebalance your inflammation. That's what a prostaglandin is. It releases cytokines, these little things that are released. When you're wounded, the bacteria also come in and then begin to grow and multiply because it's a nice place to live if you're a bacteria. Well, the chemicals that are released when your cells are broken, they do several things. So, for example, they begin to vasodilate your blood vessels. So your capillaries open up so that the blood flow can increase to the wounded area. You're going to have swelling because of that. You are going to have, some of these molecules are going to then tell your white blood cells, hey, come check out this area and see what's going on. So your white blood cells are going to start migrating to the area of the wound, and they're going to start looking around. And some of them are going to come in contact with the bacteria. What we have here is one of these macrophages, a phagocyte, and when it comes in contact with bacteria, it envelops them, it eats them. The Greek word, phagocyte, the Greek word there, phago is to eat, right? In Matthew chapter 6, when Jesus says, take no thought for your life, what you're going to eat or what you're going to drink, that word eat there is phago. And so these are cells in your body that eat bacteria when they find them. They consume it so that it goes away. This is a picture of one of those types of cells eating an anthrax bacteria, just completely encases it. And what happens here is you have the white blood cell come in contact with the bacteria, here the little red dot, and there are proteins on the surface of your white blood cells that recognize and say, hey, that's a bacteria. What do I do with it? Well, I found it, so now, since it's a bacteria, I'm going to eat it. If it comes across a red blood cell that belongs to you, it goes, you're okay, you belong here. But if you're a bacteria, it goes, you don't belong here. And it envelops you and eats you, and it does some things additionally. And so that's why your swelling goes up, your infection goes up, your white blood cells have to come in. That's what pus is, right? When you pus is the white blood cells all migrating to the area. They're going to eat that infection, assuming you don't take antibiotics, you don't put any neosporin, you don't do any of that. Those are things to help that take advantage of things we've learned about the immune system. Something I want to say here before I move any further, just so that we understand it. There is, in biology, this occurs in lots of places, you have the receptor-ligand interaction. And so when a cell wants to communicate with another cell, they don't talk to each other, okay, but they have to communicate. How do they do it? Well, I said that when the wounds are damaged, some of those chemicals are released into the environment. Well, this is one method of cell communication. So there are signals outside the cell that need to come inside the cell. And so the cell that's receiving the signal is going to have a receptor. This is a protein. It's going to have a receptor on it. And there's a reason that it looks like a lock and a key. Because the antigen or the ligand is the key that fits into that lock, that unlocks that cell and lets the signal in. There's lots of different receptors and lots of different keys. And so this one is shaped, I did it again, this one is shaped like a hand in a glove. Right? And so when the key hits the lock, it opens the lock. When the hand goes in the glove, it opens the lock. But if I try to use the hand to open the lock that matches the key, nothing's going to happen. They're not going to see each other. Well, that lock and key metaphor is what is important here in just a second. So the second kind of the immunity, we talked about the innate immunity that we all have. The acquired immunity, we all have it, but it's all different in us. There's two major cell components that take part in that. They're both white blood cells, but they're different kinds. And so you have, this is a slide about the T cell. So this is T-activated immunity. And so you've got something that comes in, a pathogen. It's eaten by that macrophage, that white blood cell that we talked about a second ago. It eats it, and it's going to digest it. Well, it's going to take pieces of that virus, in this case, and it's going to put it on the outside of its cell. It's going to hold it on its cell membrane, and it's going to say to all the other cells around, I just ate this. This is the guy. This is who's attacking us. This is a piece. This is what he looks like. Here's an identifying characteristic about him. That's going to be the ligand. That's going to be the key. You've got T cells in your body, another white blood cell that has a receptor on it. Actually, you've got billions of them, but they each have a receptor that's a little different. You know, if you think about a tumbler to your house, I looked this up last night, a five pin tumbler, some of the combinations don't work for various reasons, but there ends up being about 20,000 different possible keys that could work in that lock, right? So we understand that concept. We might have the same lock. You bought a lock for your front door at Lowe's. I bought a lock for my front door at Lowe's. They're both Schlag, okay? But your key isn't going to fit into mine, and my key's not going to fit into yours. We understand that. Well, we've got lots of T cells with lots of different receptors, or each one has a different one. They don't match each other, but one of them is going to match the piece that macrophage says, here's who's invading us. Here's the guy, who's who we're looking for. And and it's going to match up with that T cell, and it's going to activate it. It's going to turn it on. And it's going to turn it on into two different types. It's going to activate it into two different directions. One of them is going to become killer T cells. So basically what has happened is the T cell now knows who it's hunting. This is the guy I'm looking for. I'm going to go find more of them. And then the other one is a helper T cell. It's actually not on here. A helper T cell is going to do a couple of things. It's going to proliferate. They're going to grow. So you've got lots of T cells with lots of receptors that don't recognize the bad guy. And now you've got the one that recognizes the bad guy who's going to start multiplying and growing. Why? Because that's the one you need at that moment in time. You don't need the others. That's the one you need. The helper is going to help activate the B cells, which we'll talk about here in just a second, and the B cells are what are going to produce antibodies. So I'm going through it all very quickly, but do you see how all of these things are combining? You've not only got your skin, which is a physical barrier, but if you cut it, now cells of your skin themselves warn the rest of your body, hey, something's coming. You've got cells that are always on the lookout for somebody who doesn't belong there. The cells of your body can tell who is you and who's not you. Right now, you've got in you cells that go rogue, right? We call those cancer cells. Right now, all of us sitting in here have cancer. Okay, whether you realize it or not, it doesn't matter how young you are or how old you are. You've got cancer cells developing in you right now that your body, this system runs around and say, there's a guy who went rogue, let's eat him. There's a guy who went rogue, let's eat him. And they eat your cancer cells before they can grow. Eventually, because of aging, nutrition, other factors, things you're exposed to in the environment, the cancer catches up to you. Okay. B cells. So that B cell can do the same thing as the macrophage. It can encounter a pathogen, a virus. Doesn't eat it. It eats it, but it's not quite the same. Its role is to not go out and eat. But it binds to the receptor it has. It takes that antigen, puts it on the surface, and says, okay, here's a guy I found. Is he a bad guy? I don't know. I find lots of things. Is this a guy a bad guy? When he comes across a T cell that's already been activated, that's looking for the bad guy, those two match up. The one who says, I found the bad guy, and the one who says, is this a bad guy? And they get together, and they pair up, and they communicate with each other. And what the T cell then says, yes, this is who we're looking for, he tells the B cell to begin making antibodies. And your antibodies, we're all familiar, I think, with antibodies. That's how modern vaccines work. You know, the measles, you're being injected with parts of a virus, a killed virus, and your body reacts to that and starts producing antibodies. And now with the measles, you'll be protected your whole life. Chicken pox, not your whole life. COVID, 2-3 weeks, you know. All right, that's a joke. I'll tell you about COVID later. So this is where I want to highlight something here. So this is a schematic, a scientific schematic of the receptors in a T cell and in a B cell. So that you can see right off the bat they don't match. That's okay. These represent, these domains, alpha, beta, they represent protein domains, and that all goes back to your DNA and which parts of your DNA code for proteins. And so underneath immunity, there's a whole nother level of complexity. So remember I said wherever you cut it, it's complex. You never reach a simple layer. So underneath this complex layer, there's another complex layer of how do we get here in the first place. And that's DNA, and I'll do one of those lessons here in a few weeks. But what I want us to see this B cell receptor, maybe you're not as familiar with it, but what does that look like? Okay, that looks like how we draw an antibody. Well, I'll show you in a second. And so an antibody has two heavy chains, what's in the blue, and two light chains, which are in the pink or the yellow, the orange, whatever color it looks like to you. Matt, it's a different color in every place I look. But the question is how is this the lock that the key matches? And so I keep wanting to touch the screen. So this is my last slide. And so this one is the most complicated slide that I have. And so what we have up here at the top is we have a schematic representation of the DNA segment that codes for this piece of the beta receptor, the beta cells receptor, the heavy chain, this piece of the heavy chain, and you can see it's got a purple piece, an orange piece, a yellow, and a green right here at the tip. And the light chain, also at the tip, here we have the DNA schematic that represents where this piece comes from. And it's got a V and a J, it's got a purple piece and a pink piece. So these are different protein domains. And so when I say that the phage eats something and then takes a piece of it and puts it on the outside, okay, that chemical signal is almost always a protein segment of some kind. It's got, amino acids that are at a certain order, and amino acids have a three-dimensional structure, and they can fold, and they can rotate, and they can move. And so whatever that three-dimensional structure is, the antibody is going to recognize that. That's that lock mechanism. That's the tumbler. You might have a key that's got 3 pointy bits and then a valley and then another pointy bit. Well, you're doing things in multiple dimensions there. That's how it identifies it. Well, what's interesting about this, going back to the principles, and here's where we make a little bit of the application, coming back to design. In your DNA, you've got more. So you're only going to have one orange piece in your antibody. But your DNA contains multiple orange pieces. You're only going to have one yellow piece, the D region, but it's got multiple Ds. You only have one J, but it has multiple Js. Your body has many, many copies and choices here of all of these pieces. And here I have it lined out. So you've got 40 approximately. Different people are going to have different things depending on your genes. You're going to have 40 different orange regions, 25 different yellow pieces, and 6 different green pieces. On top of that, you have a gene from your mother and a gene from your father. And so if a J piece you get from your mother and a J piece from your father are going to recombine with each other. So they're going to mix and match ends. And so what you end up having is you have a combinatorial system. Just like you have a tumbler with 5 pins, you can get a 6-pin, you can get an 8-pin, you can get multiple. Well, the more pins you add, it makes it more complicated. Makes it harder to find the key that matches. With this variability, you're going to create each combination. So let's say you pick orange number 1, yellow number 1, green number 1. You're going to make one antibody that's going to be in one B cell that's going to float around in your body. You're also, in the next B cell, you're going to have orange number 2, but yellow number 1, green number 1. You're going to have that one float around. Anyway, that combination, then when you consider the short chain and the different pieces it has, gives you over 1 trillion combinations of possible antibodies. You don't produce all of these. That's the number of combinations you have. The estimates are, that's the low end. Could be up to 1,000 trillion or quadrillion combinations. Most of those antibodies, almost all of them, will never recognize anything. They're floating around in you, in one sense useless, but in another sense waiting. Now, each of us only produce, I don't know, I didn't look this up, but let's say we only have 1 billion of these choices. And so the ones you have are not the same as the ones you have, are not the same as the ones you have, are not the same as the ones you have. And what that means is a disease could come out of anywhere, a lab in China, so say for example. And what it means is that statistically speaking, somebody is immune to it. Might not be me. I'm only immune to chicken pox. But if something weird comes, maybe you're immune to it. And so it's not going to get us all. You're going to survive. So what we have on top of design, and this is where evolution has a problem, on top of design, okay, we have anticipation. Evolution doesn't allow for anticipation. Evolution is a response to a selection pressure in the past. You're immune to things that don't even exist yet. Somebody is. All of us are immune to something. Maybe it's a a Martian thing that they'll bring back on the rocket one day, or who knows what it is. Maybe it's at the bottom of the ocean waiting to be found. Maybe it's going to come out of some maniac's imagination somewhere. He thinks humans are the problem. The world would be so great if we just got rid of all the people. Let's kill everybody. Let's release a disease. That's currently science fiction, by the way, but anticipation. So Dink talked about design, and the eye is marvelous. Cut down a layer and look at the cells, and what do you have? You have anticipation. God has prepared us to be immune to diseases that don't even exist yet. Yes, sir. Oh, yeah. That was the point I wanted to make, so we're good with that, though. Does anybody have any questions? Brother Brandon, it looks like I blew your mind there. Correct. It's not. 100%. Well, and it's the other side of that. The flu vaccine changes so fast that what may work for you isn't going to work for you, and you're immune to it, but now you've got it, and by the time you get it, it's going to mutate in you, and it's going to spread to somebody else, and it's going to be slightly different than the one that you had to begin with. So it changes so fast. So think about COVID. As we went through the news, today's variant is this, tomorrow's variant is this. There was always a new variant, and they had different rates of virulence, and some of them, killed these people, and some of them were susceptible in this way. All of that goes back to this.
Figure out 1 trillion to 1,000 trillion and all these. Why can't we understand he that believeth is baptized?
Well, I would tell you that some of us can. What I don't understand is how we can't see this and know that there's an invisible thing behind it. Now, I think some of that is because, and I was steeped in it, It's never even talked about. It's just assumed. But it's just like if you grow up believing a doctrine, that's just what you believe. And it's very hard to shake somebody of their faith. And this is a system of faith we're talking about here. They have faith in themselves, in that humanity is the pinnacle, and our faith is in this. And anything that contradicts that, they're going to fight against it. Absolutely fight against it. And so you just, the blind lead the blind, and everybody falls in the ditch. Yes, sir.
Was it in the 70s when they did the search for the 1917 swine flu? They didn't have any of the, and they did a search and found, I think, Eskimos that were buried below the tundra that actually had that.
You're talking about the Spanish flu? So I don't know exactly, but the flu is something that's not new, and that one came out of, it's one of these things. It's just a regular flu virus, but it's got a few little differences, and when it's got those few little differences, it makes it more deadly for whatever reason. Maybe it's got a little difference in it that evades some of this mechanism that we saw. They can get around it. That's what HIV does. It gets around some of the immune system. Yes, Genesis.
Does this also play into the concept of the herd immunity?
So that is something else. That means if there's a disease that we can all get, like chicken pox, and you haven't had it yet, but everybody else in the room has, then if that person over there is exposed to chicken pox, you're not going to get it because they're exposed, but it hits them and stops because they're immune. So it doesn't spread to the next person and the next person and the next person. So herd immunity means just that enough people have had something that it can't spread very fast. When something is new, it spreads like fire. Look at COVID, regardless of everything. In a few months, it was all over the world. All over the world. And I mean all over the world. Now that is because we are in planes and people can fly from here to there, and I can be in Mongolia in 24 hours with whatever I'm carrying to them, and they can come to me, and I've got whatever they had in 24 hours. So some of that is because of modern technology. But herd immunity just means we've all had it, and so the susceptible people, it never gets to them to get it. Yes, sir.
With the body's ability to adapt and to change the way it can, where does the argument of a vaccine that's artificial come into play that it benefits the body compared to the body's ability, the way God designed it, to adapt to any type of vaccine?
So there's a lot of questions there, okay, a lot of different ways you can go. Let me answer it this way because we're almost out of time. And that is, when we're developing a vaccine, all we're doing is using man's wisdom, God's workmanship. We're looking at that, we're seeing an aspect of it, and we're copying it. So when we make a vaccine, once again, generally speaking, not any specific vaccine, just vaccines in general, what we're doing is we're taking this part of this system and cutting and pasting it for our own purposes. It's just like taking something on the fly. Anything that we see in the like the antibiotics. We find something in a yeast that's use it for another purpose. Right? Well, it's the same thing with the eye, like the eye and the camera. We looked at something, we wanted to copy it, and we made something inferior, but it has a function. Well, the same thing with the measles vaccine, for example. Who in here has had the measles? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I bet, statistically speaking, y'all are all a certain age or older. Who didn't raise their hands? This one and that one and this one and that one and me, right? What did we have? We had the measles vaccine. The measles vaccine works. The measles vaccine, I think, takes a dead virus, right? Is measles dead? And shows it to your body. It can't infect you, but it looks bad, and so your body does all these things. There are some viruses that are not dead, like the flu, right, is not dead. You can get the flu from the flu vaccine. It's weakened, but it's not dead. And so in that case, what we've done is we've taken a part of this and used our wisdom with technology, which I think can be good or bad, and we've used it to cure. So I think it's positive. I can answer your question later, sir. I think we're out of time.
Other questions probably at the we call the last session here. Critical thinking. So if you got any more questions for Chris, and man, it's a fascinating presentation. Save them for the critical thinking. Appreciate you so very much, brother. Thank you so much. And you guys can see.
And I can dig post holes. So. Doubly useful.
Sure.
I've got a fence that needs to be put up now. If anybody needs something to do, maybe under a certain age. Do what?
Skip your lunch break.
Yeah.
Well, we appreciate these guys and wonderful presentation today. Think about what Brother Dink did on yesterday and what Chris did today. We got a wealth of talent, knowledge, wisdom, and expertise right here in the Lord's church. Thank God for that. Thank God for that. All right, so take a break, about a 10-minute break, and we'll